I, Harry S. Truman.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
I, Jimmy Carter.
I, Ronald Reagan.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
I, William Jefferson Clinton.
I, George Walker Bush.
I, Barack Hussein Obama.
I, Donald John Trump.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully
execute
the office of President of the United States.
Will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution
of the United States.
So help me God.
For George Washington, the newly confirmed president-elect, April of 1789 was an incongruous month as he was flatteringly elected to the top position in the American government, but seemingly unable to afford the trip to New York, the capital, to attend his own inauguration. The entire business brought to mind the truth of the uncertain glory of the April day, lamented by Shakespeare and his two gentlemen from Verona. George, despite being the owner of nearly 50,000 acres of prime land, along with his beloved Mount Vernon estate, was in fact land poor, a term commonly used to depict the disparity between a bank account that was emptier than a politician's promises, while conversely being quite wealthy in assets. By today's equivalence, Washington's holdings extended past $28 million in worth, and by some evaluations, even into the billions. None of which was doing him any good this particular April. He had thought to simply request some of the debts owed to him be paid back, at least enough to afford his upcoming trip, but none of his acquaintances were any better off than he. Well, almost all his friends were similarly afflicted, except for one from whom the beleaguered general agreed to borrow £100 at 6% interest, so he could make it to his appointment at Federal Hall to be sworn in as the first president of the United States. He was good for the money, obviously, with his vast properties alongside the fact that Congress had voted to pay the new president a salary equaling 2% of the federal budget at that time, an offer that Washington had at first refused, wary of the appearance of corruption, but was eventually convinced by Congress to take the $25,000 per year salary, reasoning that he did not want to set a precedent of the nation electing only persons of wealth to serve in the presidency. So obviously that's aged well. By comparison, in today's economy, the salary would have an equivalency of somewhere around $896,000. Definitely not a trifling sum, and particularly helpful in providing for the Washington household, which was extensive. If you've been waiting as anxiously as George himself to hear the rest of the story, you'll be relieved to know that he made it to his inauguration on time and on his borrowed dime, and was sworn in as the president without any further unfortunate monetary incidents. It was an era of firsts for the fledgling nation, just trying to learn how to walk on its magnificent aspirations for nationhood. There were bound to be a few faltering moments, and some straight-up what-the-heck situations. John Adams, elected to follow George Washington's 2 terms in office, was the first to have his oath officiated by a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, though his family was presumably too busy washing their hair to be in attendance at the stately occasion. By contrast, James Madison arrived at the Long Hotel on the evening of March 4, 1809, where he attended the inaugural ball his wife had organized for him, the first to be held on the actual date of the inauguration. And to her credit, the lively and wildly popular Dolly showed up for both her husband's inauguration and to dance the night away with the 4th president, dazzling everyone with her velvet low-cut buff gown with a long train attached. Every presidency deserves to kick off with an exceptional shindig, and Andrew Jackson took this to heart, inviting the public to party like it was 1899 in celebration of his promotion. Unfortunately for Old Hickory, it was only 1829, and 20,000 enthusiastic revelers took him up on his invitation, crowding into the White House until it fairly burst at the seams, and surrounding the well-liked president, nearly trampling him to death in their excitement. Jackson escaped the festivities through a side exit and headed off to a hotel to get some uninterrupted shut-eye, while the partiers were eventually lured from the house and onto the south lawn with tubs of whiskey-laced punch, which were cleverly positioned to this end. Jumping down the list of firsts, Warren G. Harding would be the first president to travel by automobile back and forth from his inauguration to the White House. Harry S. Truman would have the privilege of millions witnessing his swearing in on televisions everywhere. And in celebration of the Air Force, having B-36 bombers give demonstrations which flew uncomfortably close to the White House and was surprisingly never repeated thereafter. And then there was old Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison, who was in fact the oldest president to be elected at the time and whose inauguration was fraught with bad decisions. The studious president-elect and son of founding father Benjamin Harrison took a moment to pen an inaugural address so tediously long-winded that Senator Daniel Webster helpfully took red ink to his friend's thesis, which was rife with classical allusions, and knocked it back down to the most relevant 8,445 words. Upon completion of the grueling task, the gifted orator and wordsmith joked that he had killed 17 Roman proconsuls as dead as smelts, every one of them, throughout his long day of editing. However, the soon-to-be Secretary of State's efforts would not be enough to prevent the impending disaster, as the new president delivered his lengthy speech outside in the frigidly snowy weather, refusing to don a coat or even a hat. After the 2-hour speech was concluded, the tough Major General turned top executive proceeded to ride horseback rather than travel in the state carriage on the trip back to the White House. I suspect it will come as no surprise to you, dear viewer, that the unfortunate president also holds the record for the shortest tenure of office, as he succumbed to pneumonia 31 days into his presidency, proving your mother's insistence that putting on your coat and hat before going out wasn't a misplaced imperative. But even dressing warmly couldn't have helped Andrew Johnson. On March 4, 1865, a very ill vice president downed a few fortifying shots of medicinally distilled spirits before heading out to the podium to deliver a rambling address that would leave Abraham Lincoln, the president, looking on in growing horror. Meanwhile, Senator Zachariah Chandler of Michigan later admitted to his wife that he had never been more mortified in his entire life, and had wished for a handy hole to open up in the ground so that he could have dropped into it. Oblivious to everyone else's discomfort, the typhoid fever-riddled Johnson, who had gotten his second wind on the wings of whiskey and a prayer, slurred his way through a recounting of his humble origins, and warming to the topic of his greatness, continued with a telling of his victories over the Confederate rebels. Behind him, Hannibal Hamlin, the outgoing vice president, captured his coattails, tugging on them in an attempt to put a stop to the increasingly painful ordeal, to no avail. The entire affair came to a resounding end when the VP attempted to swear in the new senators, but was finally forced to hand over the duty to the Senate clerk when his confusion got the best of him. Lincoln later defended his embarrassed friend, assuring the public he'd known Johnson for many years, and they had nothing to be scared about because Andy ain't a drunkard. A ringing endorsement if ever I've heard one, and one just begging to be embraced as an election slogan, emblazoned on campaign buttons and across posters. As it sadly turned out, old Andy wouldn't need either, as he was suddenly elevated to the position of the 17th President of the United States, after Honest Abe was murdered by John Wilkes Booth, approximately a month after the inaugural incident. In an eerie premonition of the future, photos were taken at the very same inauguration, showing John Wilkes Booth standing above Lincoln and to the side on the stage as the great man made his speech. The thespian assassin would later confide to his diary his excellent opportunity to kill the president that day, had he wished to. And then there were the birds. Inaugurations have not been kind to the feathered folk. Starting way back in 1873, with the inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant, who thought canaries would add such an elegant and festive touch to his inaugural ball, where he imagined them serenading guests in their sweet lilting tones from cages hung throughout his venue. In jarring contrast to this lovely vision, March 4th dawned as the coldest day in recorded history in the capital. Despite the thermometers reading of 4 degrees, the wind chill factor managed to put a fine edge on the already uncomfortably sharp blade, making the relative feel a negative 15 to 30. The flags along Pennsylvania Avenue, which might otherwise have been blowing vigorously in the 40-mile-per-hour wind, were frozen mid-action or ripped apart entirely. The inaugural ball had been planned to be held in a large temporary structure, not equal to the task of warming the guests, who remained in their heavy winter coats as they danced and partook of the icy food and frozen champagne. The canaries, having not been outfitted with tiny fur coats, were not so fortunate, and 100 birds stood frozen in their gilded cages by the end of the event. an historic fact that the Pixies found particularly outrageous. But Richard Nixon took epic bird tragedies to a whole other level with his notoriously questionable relationship with good judgment. Having put some thought into his inauguration, he decided he wasn't inclined to invite any pigeons to attend his big day, and to be certain they didn't attempt to crash his party, the 37th president and vocal supporter of the Vietnam War ordered the chemical repellent Roost Begone be sprayed along his parade route, assuring the public that the slickly adhesive matter was non-toxic and would simply prevent the birds from sitting in the branches and raining on his parade with their droppings. Unfortunately, the polybutene-containing spray was not for the birds, and the road to the White House was grotesquely strewn with the corpses of pigeons. But Nixon hadn't seen the last of his foul troubles. Once more, his chickens came home to roost when his Smithsonian Museum inaugural ball was crashed by a testy rooster who had presumably overheard the partying going on and assumed his invitation had been mistakenly overlooked. He immediately corrected this governmental oversight by joining some guests in their $1,000 box and acted the cad by immediately assaulting a female occupant. Here, you may thank us for refraining from indulging in all the blatantly obvious comparisons one might make between DC and rooster etiquette. It was indeed painful for us. Anyway, the secretary of the Smithsonian was eventually successful in smoothing the ruffled feathers of the indignantly bad-mannered interloper and removed his foul person back to the Colonial Barn exhibit from which he had escaped. It really feels like we should have seen some things on the horizon with this administration, but alas, hindsight and all. When George first borrowed that £100 to finance his trip to New York for his own inauguration, I suspect he felt a bit sheepish that he had found himself in this position in the first place. I wonder if he could have imagined that 236 years later, we would be swearing in our 47th president, or that he himself would stand as a continual ideal for all the presidents who followed. All things considered, he needn't have worried overly, as he at least managed to come in out of the cold, refrained from massacring crowds of birds, and stayed sober through it all. It turns out a little common sense goes a long way in the history books. Unfortunately, it's just not nearly as entertaining. We do hope you enjoyed today's video, and that if you have, you'll like it, comment, share, and even subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, as it all helps us continue to grow. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.